Got it? Now I want you to ask yourself why. Why do I desire whatever it is that I most desire? Because this is the fundamental question that... okay, you can open your eyes again. This is the fundamental question that Amia's book asks us to confront. And that is how we are conditioned, socialised, educated, and even harassed into our desires. Amia, as I mentioned, the book sprang from your incendiary LRB essay of 2018, which itself turned on the case of Elliot Rodger, the world's most famous incel. Can you tell us firstly why you wrote that essay and what conclusions you drew in it about the limits of liberal discourse of rights and entitlements when it comes to sex?
Yes. So by now everyone knows the horrific story of Elliot Rodger's murderous rampage and is also familiar with his quite twisted and disturbing justifications of that rampage. But I initially started writing the essay as just an analysis of these kind of compounding pathologies you see in Rodger. So not just male sexual entitlement, but also racism. He had quite a bit of internalized self-loathing as someone who was part Asian, but also was filled with anti-Black racism. There was also a lot of class entitlement. He was very rich and thought of himself as his attention and access to their bodies because of his family's money. But then what I came to be interested in with Rodger was the way in which the mainstream feminists seemed unwilling to even go near Elliot Rodger's central part of Rodger's own account of his rampage and the justifications for it. Because yes, there was enormous amounts of racism and sexism in what he said, but he also said something that was quite interesting. He claimed that he had been sort of sexually excluded and marginalized because he didn't live up to the norms of heteromasculinity, right? He was effete, he wasn't good at sports, he was shy, and he diagnosed himself as being sexually marginalized as a result of failing to live up to these kind of stereotypical demands of, white heteromasculinity. And I don't think this was a good account, to be clear. I think it was at least massively overdetermined that women were terrified of Rodger and didn't want to go near him. But in principle, the idea that people are sometimes sexually marginalized as a result of racism, of other structures of oppression like racism or classism or ableism, is absolutely right. I mean, it's not just in principle possible, it's actually real. I mean, you can look at for example, something like dating apps that give a very clear illustration of this phenomenon, right? The way in which lots of people will just explicitly say that they aren't interested in dating or having sex with people of certain races, for example. And we're used to thinking of our sexual desires, and this is why your little experiment, Claire, was so great, as these highly personal things, right? We have to close our eyes because we have to get inside ourselves and it's no one else's business. It's not something that should be subject to any kind of public, let alone political scrutiny. But at the same time, if we honestly reflect, it's very clear that our sexual desires and preferences are, in many cases, shaped by these broader political forces, often very ugly forces like racism, sexism, and so on. And so what I'm trying to do in that essay is open up the space for that conversation, right? And to do so requires us moving beyond this kind of standard liberal or sex positive way of thinking about sexual desire. I don't think it's totally fair to put those two things together, right? Because I think sex positivity as it emerged in the 1980s was a much more radical project of really trying to encourage all forms of sexuality, not just hegemonic straight sexuality. But as sex positivity is often practiced now or understood now, it just is a kind of milquetoast liberal view, which is to say, oh, we don't have to interrogate desires. Everyone wants what they want. The only relevant question is whether sex is consensual or not. And that's what I'm trying to push against.
And we're going to get back to that question of consent in a minute, because it's fundamental to this conversation we're having. I want to touch base first, though, on a concept that you introduce in that discussion about Roger Elliott and the incel. And for people who don't know what incel is, it stands for involuntary celibacy that has become a kind of movement. Central to your analysis of that is the idea of fuckability, the trained, ingrained idea that certain people are sexy or hot, to use common parlance, and others not so much or not at all. That there's like a hierarchy of desirability that you argue ultimately impoverishes both the fucker and the fuckee. So what does it mean to be fuckable?
I mean, it's 6:50 in the morning here, so I'm just like, this feels more like an evening conversation. So, yeah, the notion of fuckable or fuckability that I'm using in the book as a bit of a term of art is not supposed to be tracking who actually is or is not having sex. So, but rather, exactly as you said, Claire, it's supposed to be about one's place in a sexual hierarchy, right? A way of thinking about that is which sexual partners accrue to me social status, right? Being attractive to which sorts of people, which sorts of bodies make me increase my own social value or my own social standing. And I think there are clearly sexual hierarchies in this sense. I don't think that they're natural. I think they are the creation of politics. And you see lots of other systems of oppression that we do recognize sort of outside the bedroom, constructing and creating those hierarchies of fuckability or sexual desirability. So race, class, ability, and so on. One reason that these two things come apart, the question of where you stand on this kind of social hierarchy and whether or not you are in fact having sex, is precisely because some people, in virtue of being fairly low in the hierarchy, are more susceptible to forms of sexual assault, right? I mean, so under conditions of white domination, women of color, especially Black women, Aboriginal women, have been historically coded as super sexually promiscuous, right? And therefore kind of unrapeable, right? Not unrapeable in the sense that you can't rape them, but if you were to have coercive sex with them, it wouldn't even count as rape because, as it were, the consent is always given. Rapeability exists against a background assumption of chastity, so it's kind of racialized as white under conditions of white domination, white supremacy. So this, in part, I think, explains the much higher rates of sexual assault against women of color, especially Black women and Aboriginal women, and is explained in part by the relatively low status on a sexual hierarchy, right? That they hold. So fuckability has very little to do with who is actually having sex or not, and everything to do with a broader understanding of social stratification and social esteem as relates to our bodies.
Let's go back to consent, because what you're talking about here is that it's not only who we are conditioned to find and consider sexy, but what we are trained to find sexy about sex. And that's the issue, isn't it? Perhaps my favourite essay in the book is the one titled "On Not Sleeping with Your Students." And in it you grapple with the notion of consent, and you argue that the absence of consent isn't the only indicator of problematic sex. Just as worrisome, you argue, is the fact that, quote, boys and men are socialised to find domination sexy and girls and women to find subordination sexy. And also that there is a kind of coercion, not directly, but by the informal regulatory system of gendered sexual expectations. And therefore what I'm saying is that you make a distinction between what is legal and what is ethical. So we focused a lot of attention on consent. There's certainly in Australia recently, there's been a lot of feminist activism and policy work done. As recently as last year, we had affirmative consent laws passed, and I know that's the same in Britain. But what you're arguing is that for most women, what we are actively consenting to is a kind of patriarchal sex that isn't based on what women desire in any sense. So I want to ask you, in what ways are ideas about what sex looks like and how it should feel and how it should sound produced and reproduced so that women's subordination to what men want from them is in itself eroticized?
Yes, great question. So I don't want to be too universalist here, right? I think that in the book, I'm reaching back to, as some people will already have kind of detected from the conversation, Claire, you and I have been having, I reach back to an older second wave feminist tradition in which this very idea that you were just mentioning plays a central role, right? This idea that women's subordination in the workplace or in the university, in the factory, is bound up with the eroticization of women's subordination in the bedroom, right? And actually comes from that in a fundamental way. And I think that second wave perspective, or that radical feminist perspective, is extremely powerful, but I also think at the same time it can be taken to be too universal. So I don't think one has to insist that that is true of every sexual encounter or every heterosexual encounter, or it's true for every woman. But I think what we're really talking about is a social script, right? A kind of a social tendency which is reinforced by different kinds of training that people, women and men, girls and boys, undergo from a very young age. Training that happens in the family, it happens via media, now by social media, by online pornography, but also reinforced by practices of subordination that happen outside the bedroom. So to give an example of the university, one thing I'm trying to argue in that essay on not sleeping with your students is that, when universities try and regulate against professor-student relationships, they also almost always do it in terms of the power difference between teacher and student. And they say that power difference doesn't allow the student to freely consent to having sex with her professor. And I think that's just very often inaccurate, right? I think there are lots of students who are perfectly capable of consent and enthusiastically consent to sex with their professors. But I do think that there is nonetheless a kind of problematic dynamic going on there, which is an eroticization of a differential, not just a general differential in power, but the kind of specific differential in power that you find in the classroom, the differential in knowledge and understanding. And I think women and men, girls and boys alike are socialized to find that differential erotically charged. So the problem isn't consent. It's not even, I think, always people not having the kind of sex they want to have, although that's very often true, I think, especially for young women. I think lots of young women, university-age women, are not having the kind of sex that they want to have and feel like they don't have options for different forms of sex. But sometimes it's also that people are having the kind of sex that they want to have, but the kind of sex that they themselves want to have is something that is determined by a script not written by them, is maybe a good way of putting it.
People are nodding furiously in the audience here with you, Amia. So is what you're saying also that consent education in schools, which is a very big thing that we're talking about now and investing a lot of money in now, the kind of no means no consent education and affirmative consent laws. So are you saying that's only the start of this story, not the end of the story?
Absolutely. So I think consent training is a good thing, and I think affirmative consent training is a good thing. I'm a little skeptical, I have to say, of affirmative consent laws. I mean, if you think about the history of rape law, we have these kind of shifting goalposts as to what is the criterion of rape, right? What makes a sexual interaction rape? We begin historically with the presence of violence, right? Then we have the presence of coercion, which might not involve violence, might just involve threat. We then have the absence of consent. And then with the shift to affirmative consent, we have the absence of affirmation, the absence of a yes. And when you look at this history, it's a bit like we're trying to chase down this thing. We're trying to put our finger on this thing that's bad about intuitively bad about certain kinds of sex. What is it that's bad? Well, think about an affirmative consent law. What is it that now needs to be present such that a sexual interaction is no longer rape? We just need whereas before with the traditional consent law, you needed a man to make sure that a woman just didn't say no. Now we need to make sure that the man needs to make sure that the woman says yes, right? But a woman saying yes is consistent with there still being something problematic in that sexual interaction. Because what is it that's problematic? Well, what we want people, one of the questions is, why is it such a widespread phenomenon for men to be turned on by women's not wanting to have sex, right? Why is there this kind of systematic misalignment of interests and desires? Like what's missing here? And so in a sense, what we're trying to do when we change the law on rape is we're trying to use the law to do something I think it can't really do, which is to rule out patriarchal forms of sex, right? Sex that is based not on something like mutual respect and creativity, but is instead based on, again, this eroticization of a particular gender dynamic. And I don't think the law can really ever do that for us by its very nature, because the way the law needs to work is it needs to have a very clear criterion that can then be applied in cases, right? So you can make decisions. And that's just the nature of the law, and that's fine. But I don't think we should be trying, when we're educating young people, to be reaching to notions that are central to the law alone, right? We need to be thinking about things like agency, desire, respect, mutual respect, forms of self-respect. These are the kinds of things I think we need to be talking about when we're talking about sex with young people. And conversations about consent and affirmative consent will only take us so far.
Rousing round of applause for you there, Amia, on that point. You can't hear it. That's why I'm subtitling it for you. Amia, you mentioned, we're getting a big burst of wind. Amia, you mentioned before, you touched on your own intellectual practice of going back to second wave feminism. And that's one of the things I think I appreciated most about the book, was its constant referral to and critical assessment of a previous generation of feminist scholars. Andrea Dawkin and Catherine McKinnon are particular touchstones for your own reading. And you never claim or insinuate that you're the first person ever to discover sexism or engage in these ideas, which I think is a common fault of many younger feminist writers who lack your intellectual rigour. I also found myself thinking back to the first wave feminists and how the women we now most associate with winning the vote, winning political autonomy, were also arguing for autonomy over their own sex lives, for the legal and moral right to say no to their husbands. It wasn't lack of birth control that meant that women had 8 or 12 babies, but conjugal rights were actually the law. And a husband could beat his wife or divorce her for non-compliance in the bedroom, and obviously conjugal rights still do exist in some countries like India. I'm wondering how necessary you think, how empowering you think it is to know our own collective history. I mean, how important is it? How important has the erasure of women's or gay or trans history been as a tool of patriarchy by disconnecting us from our histories?
Yeah, I mean, I still think that the person who's best on that particular question is Adrienne Rich, another second wave American feminist and wonderful poet who, I mean, this is a recurring theme for her, but she writes about it very eloquently in Of Woman Born, and I won't do justice, but also in her famous essay on compulsory heterosexuality and lesbian existence, right? Where for her, the erasure of women's history, or not even the erasure, the denial of its very existence, that there is the history to women's ideas, women's actions, women as agents in history, things that move society in directions and new directions, is just absolutely central to women's contemporary lack of political self-understanding, right? And I think that's right. I mean, I think we are at a moment where that's less true, at least in various cases. I mean, in the UK, in the US, and Australia, there are lots of people who now work on women's history. There's obviously still much more work to be done. But I also think that there's maybe this kind of specific issue for young contemporary feminists. So I love that feminism is back. When I was an undergraduate, feminism was not a thing. It was not cool. I mean, feminism had died a death in the Anglophone world in the kind of mid 90s. And when I was an undergraduate in the early 21st century, it didn't really have any kind of presence on campus. And that, I think, started changing after 2008 with the financial crisis. And we started renewing lots of attention to forms of kind of radical politics, including feminist politics. And I think that's altogether a good thing. But I do think that there's this tendency in contemporary young feminism to want to just leave aside historical feminists as just having been sort of crucially mistaken, right? Or alternatively, just venerate them as, they're your foremothers who have to be worshipped. And I think, and I'm not the first person to say this, I mean, someone like Kathy Weeks is really wonderful on this issue. We need to find ways of relating to women's history and feminist history that don't involve just maternal veneration or maternal sort of hatred, right? And on the question of the second wave feminists in particular, so someone like McKinnon's an incredibly powerful and important feminist thinker and writer. She is continuously thrilling for me to read. At the same time, I disagree with her profoundly on some of the most important issues for her. So it's not just kind of fringe disagreements. I disagree with her kind of centrally about the use of the law and the use of state power in pursuit of gender justice. I'm a kind of quite strong critic of carceral approaches to feminism generally, And so want to show in the book in part that we can tease apart different pieces of the kind of feminist legacy, right? So we could agree with McKinnon on her powerful indictment of the eroticization of gendered subordination, while disagreeing with her on the role that the law or the state, and especially the carceral state, should play in addressing that. So I'd like to advocate for a more complex relationship to feminist history, one that doesn't think it's something to just be accepted or rejected, but it's something to be creatively reappropriated and reimagined as we go forward into a 21st century feminism.
You're getting more applause on that one there as well. Amia, I want to stick with the kind of the generational aspect of your work here. I must admit, reading your book made me feel a bit old. I felt like maybe you were talking to a generation who's kind of your age or under. I'm 53. And maybe, your students, millennials, the generation whose sexuality most interfaces with Tinder and Grindr and Instagram. As a woman who has children of the Tinder generation, I'm curious to see how you see your idea of emancipatory sexual ethics and practices might apply to an older cohort of women, much like the women who make up our audience here, and perhaps women who have been married for decades. It's these women, I'd suggest, for whom the nature of consent can perhaps be most problematic, given, as you write, quote, the psychological structures that make men want to have sex with women who don't really want it, and that make women feel they must have sex with men when they don't want to, those psychological structures are very hard to break. So I know I'm kind of dipping into Estelle Perel territory here, but I wonder what the right to sex might constitute for older married women. Is it feasible or beneficial or preferable to leave long-term marriages and dismantle nuclear families because the sex isn't great?
Yeah, I mean, despite having written a book called The Right to Sex and whose chapters in one way or another intersect with sexual politics, I think that the importance of sex is sort of often overstated, in part because popular culture is so run by and geared towards young people for whom, sex, not for everyone, but for many of them is a very kind of live preoccupation, especially once they leave their family homes. And I'm concerned by a discourse around sex that sees sex as another component in a potentially perfectible individual life, right? And that wants us all to see our lives, women and men, as I don't want to say sort of, as projects that see sort of self-fulfillment, right, as something that can be achieved individually, right? And self-fulfillment is about having, depending on what age you are, about having like the right kind of family, having the right sort of children and the right sort of careers, having the right sort of body through the right sort of exercise regime, having the right sort of sexually fulfilling relationship with the right sort of person. And this way of thinking, which is very congenial to capital, right? Because it's a great way of selling people stuff that they don't really need, is also terrifyingly individualistic, right? And distracts from the fact that most of our problems are social and structural. I'm not saying that we don't all have individual existential crises. I'm a philosopher after all, but so much of our, I think, pathologies of loneliness and social ennui and meaninglessness cannot be addressed at a kind of individual level, or even within an individual family or within an individual relationship, I think we're often crying out for better forms of community, better public spaces, more social support, more hope, ecological hope, right? So this is a weird way I take it to answer the question about whether someone should leave their partner. But I mean, obviously if people are profoundly unhappy, then and if they feel, I think, that growth isn't possible anymore in a context, then, I certainly wouldn't counsel anyone to stay. At the same time, I think this idea that the individual can be perfected, right? And that if I only make the right decisions, I can be happy, is a very pernicious idea. I think it's very interesting. I always tell my students this when we read Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex. I say, look, it's really important for you to remember that Beauvoir actually isn't interested in happiness. Her complaint isn't that patriarchy makes women unhappy. She actually thinks a lot of women are very perfectly happy under patriarchy. The problem is that there are forms of unfreedom, right? And freedom can only be really found for Beauvoir through the emancipation of everyone, including men. She sees men as also being unfree. And this is how I think about freedom. I don't think about freedom as just an individual project. I also think that forms of unhappiness and suffering and tragedy are kind of inherent in what it is to be human. I mean, we all decay and grow old and die. One of the things I wish I had written about in the book, and I think it was a failure not to, was about aging. And aging is a gendered phenomenon. We all do grow old. But it means something very different for women and men, especially when it comes to sexual desire and sexual desirability and that hierarchy of fuckability we were speaking about. And I certainly think we should think about age as up there with these other categories that structure hierarchies of desirability in really problematic ways. But I think what's needed is forms of collective emancipation. And the fact that older women are scripted as unsexually desirable is completely bound up with the implicit function to which women are assigned, which is that, they're assigned the function of reproducing the species, right? So it's no surprise that, quote, female desirability ends with the moment that women, are no longer able, if they were ever able, to play that traditional role in biological reproduction. So really at the heart of this is this understanding of what women are for, right? And what we want is a society in which no one is really for anything, right? They aren't seen as having an implicit social purpose, but rather are seen as subjects of, subjects who get to decide what they are for. So I think there are, deep questions here about age that reveal fundamental political truths about gender. So this isn't really to give specific advice to any particular woman, but I think there's a lot more to be said here.
Again, big round of applause for you, Amia. I'm going to ask one more question while people consider what questions they might like to ask. And if you want to come up to the mic, it's in the middle of the grounds here. So do come up if you've got a question. Amia, we've been talking a lot today about women and men, and I know that intersectionality is integral to your analysis, and you're clearly a trans ally. You do direct engagement with trans women in the Right to Sex. But I wonder what the trans challenge to the gender binary might have to contribute to the sort of critique of feminism you are espousing. How might the radical emancipatory possibilities of non-binary thinking challenge the politics and the practice of desire?
Yes. So I think, so I want to say two things. So I want to both agree with the presupposition. So I want to begin by agreeing with the presupposition of the question. I think that it's really important to see that trans people, non-binary people, are kicking back against that very same system, that very same disciplinary system of sex and gender distinction that oppresses women and many men, especially gay men and queer men. And those forms of resistance can look very different, right? And I think one thing that can be a struggle for certain, cis feminists is to understand that resistance against the sex gender binary takes many forms, and forms that might not be familiar to oneself. But I despair, I have to say, at a feminism that doesn't see these different modes of resistance as resistance, right? I mean, the wonderful feminist theorist Jacqueline Rose, says something to the effect of, all of us grate against the bar of the gender difference in kind of different ways. And the thing she says she wants to say to trans exclusionary feminists is, who do you think you are, right? How do you really think you have such a secure relation to your body, your gender, your sex, that you can simply insist on the identities of other people? And if you want to say to yourself, yeah, I do have such a secure sense. I mean, think about your dreams, your actual literal dreams. I don't mean your hopes for the future. Think about the way in which alternative counterfactual versions of yourself, different sexed versions, different gendered versions, non-binary versions, literally haunt you, right? What for someone like Jacqueline Rose, who's a Freudian feminist, that reveals the kind of uneasy relationships that we all humans have to these questions of sex and gender, these regimes of difference that are sort of imposed on us. And what I would like for feminism is a broad recognition of the way in which these regimes, these disciplinary regimes, serve really none of us very well, including the men who superficially benefit, but I think deeply are punished by these systems as well. And then to see lots of different people trying to make different forms of accommodation. And I think the interesting political question is, which forms of accommodation are recognized and legally sanctified, and which forms of accommodation are not, are punished?
That's a great answer, and that goes back to your arguments about carceralism as well. We might not have much time to talk about that, but it's a very important aspect of your book in terms of what legal solutions, where the limits of the legal solutions are. Those were very stimulating parts of the book. Got a question from a fella back here.
Yes, look, thank you for that outstanding presentation. I ran a trauma unit for 30 years, and at the end of it, towards the end, I was seeing people with HIV, which took me to Africa. And the right to sex for women was tied up with their source of income, even though they were well educated. So at the truck stops, all the way from Kampala down to, through Addis Ababa, down to Johannesburg, the only way to persuade women who needed to have sex for income was to persuade them to wear femidoms. So to what extent is that a feminist, something that is planned and promoted by people who seek to protect women whose principal source of income often, especially in poor countries, is to have sex?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm just so grateful for the way you posed that question, because so often when we have conversations, I mean, I think less in Australia, but certainly in the UK and in the US, when we have conversations about sex workers, the money issue, the financial drive is sort of pushed to the side, right? So, for example, people will ask questions like, well, would a sex worker do this work if she weren't being paid? And as if that's supposed to show that there's something especially wrong or bad about sex work. But of course, most of us wouldn't do the work we do if we weren't being paid. And financial necessity lies at the base of most choices, especially the work choices made by poor women in the global South. I think a feminism worth having must center sex workers, and must specifically have a relationship to sex work that is sort of ruthlessly practical, right? It is an affront and a provocation, I think, to lots of feminists for really good reason. The very idea of sex work, the very idea of a woman having to sell sex for money, and the very idea of a man who would be, who finds that transaction itself erotically satisfying, right? Who again who is turned on by the financial and often racial asymmetry that produces sex work. That, I think, is a provocation to feminist sensibilities. But I think too many feminists are motivated by their kind of symbolic dislike of sex work, to endorse policies that actually end up harming sex workers, right? So forms of criminalization, or even something like the Nordic model, these are things that make life worse for sex workers. And sex workers, as you've just so correctly pointed out, are very often the poorest women in a society. And so this is a way in which I think this is part of how I think feminists need to relate to questions of the law. They need to set aside sometimes the symbolic satisfactions that can be had from outlawing sex work or criminalizing sex work, for example, and instead be, as I said, kind of ruthlessly realistic, thinking, what can we actually do to improve the lives of sex workers who are very often the worst off women? So the kind of thing you were describing would be, for me, absolutely central to a feminism that we can really get behind.
More clapping. I've got another question here for you, Amia.
Hello, thank you so much for your wisdom and insights. I think particularly it's apt being International Women's Day today, and I know that you've kind of prefaced your philosophical work as being existential and not shying away from the heaviness that brings. But I'm sensing in my circles at least there's this collective unease and exhaustion when it comes to kind of unpacking the patriarchy and the things that I'm really looking forward to looking at your book. I'm interested in what your thoughts on despair and how you sit with despair when it comes to the patriarchy and I guess in a day like today, the silence of men, and it's often the women standing up and voicing and speaking up, which is clearly important, but how that can be a collective thing for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I think despair is a political emotion. It's an emotion that is kind of systematically produced by certain forms of politics and political reality. I mean, I feel despair, I'll say, most often when just thinking about climate change and the climate crisis. I think at the same time, it's not something you can dwell in, right? I think it's something you can feel, and then you need to move on from that. I think the best antidote to despair is action, right? So I think sometimes we think of ourselves as needing to first feel some sort of hope and optimism, and then getting involved in an action that will be a vehicle for that hope. I actually think that's getting it backwards. I think the people who are least despairing are the people who are most engaged in forms of actual political engagement. And I think, and this was actually said to me by a friend who works on climate things when I was expressing intense despair. He's like, well, this is just because you're not doing anything. But if you were actually simply very involved in forms of liberatory, radical practice around climate, you would be, those feelings in a sense would go away. And they don't go away totally, of course. Everyone sort of moves, I think, between a dialectic of despair and hope. But I think it's easiest to feel despair when one isn't doing something, and when one is also politically isolated, when one isn't forming forms of solidarity and camaraderie with people. So that's my kind of personal answer to the problem of despair. And men, yes. The silence of men. One needs to demand more, I think, and want more. I think that the idea of want and desire and its role in feminism goes way beyond sexual want and desire. I think women need to just want more in general and demand more in general, and tell the men who are being silent what it is that we would like to hear from them and what it is we would like them to do. So, and women are trained not to want and not to express their wants. So I think that's very hard. But I think this project of wanting goes beyond the bedroom, right? And its most important site, I actually think, is the political arena. So if there are men who aren't saying what you want them to say, tell them what it is we would like them to hear.
Whoa, that's dangerous, isn't it? We've got time for one last quick question, and it's from a man in the audience.
I think that women would probably agree that their lot has improved over the last 200 years or so, and probably since 2008, as you said, with the GFC, it's accelerated the gains that they have made. If you where do you think it'll finish? I mean, men and women are different. Biologically, we aren't the same.
I'm so sorry. My internet briefly cut out. So I heard men and women are different. We aren't the same. But where will it? Where will
that's probably
end?
A good place to end it. I think we're actually past 6 o'clock, and I think our gentleman's question was somewhat rhetorical. So let's thank Amia very much for her extremely stimulating, inspiring work. If my university hadn't have gotten rid of its philosophy department recently, I think that there would be a great spike in student numbers with people like you leading the charge in philosophy, politics, and taking it to the streets. Thank you so much, Amia. Everybody, please go to the bookstore. If you're watching this somewhere else in Australia, go to your local independent bookstore. If you're here in Adelaide, it's in the book tent. I'm sorry you can't be here, Amia, to sign copies and to go to the hotel bar with me now and talk a lot more about these things and also other things. Thank you for being with us. Thanks for everybody for coming today.